She sealed a copper pipe with water and made a heater. Elias Bourne, 30 years a blacksmith and boiler patcher, told her, "If that seam opens in the night, your girls die first." She had $12, 2 daughters, and no way to move heat across 40 feet of barn. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 62 degrees in 11 hours. But 4 months earlier, Minerva Hale had never sealed a pressure seam in her life. She had arrived in Hadley Township in August of 1887 with a husband who could swing an axe but not dodge a wheel, 2 daughters, a trunk of mended clothes, and the kind of hope that looks, from a distance, almost exactly like ignorance. The wagon that killed Thomas Hale slipped its brake on a grade 2 miles from the river crossing. The front wheel caught his chest before he could roll clear. He died in the road dust with his boots still laced, 14 days before the first hard frost, and left behind a wife who had never wintered alone, 2 girls too young to haul water, a stack of debts tallied in a hardware merchant's ledger, and a legal mess that gave Minnie exactly one structure she could occupy without the bank's written permission. Not the house. The house went to probate. Thomas's brother had co-signed the claim, and the brother's creditors moved faster than grief. The barn, 40 feet long, plank-walled, high-roofed, built for cattle that never came. The door hung on leather hinges. The loft was open to the ridge. Wind entered from the south through gapped siding and exited through the north eave without slowing down. The only heat source was a small cast-iron box stove, rated for a one-room cabin, that Thomas had bought second-hand for $3 and hauled in the wagon bed beside his daughters. Minnie could not leave. She had no passage money east. Her parents were dead. Her nearest relation was an aunt in Ohio who had returned her last letter unopened. The team belonged to Thomas's brother, already claimed. $12 in coin and scrip sat in a jar behind a loose board, and $12 would not buy a train ticket, a room, or a fresh start for a woman with 2 children and no trade. She was staying. The only question was whether the barn would let her. Elias Bourne arrived on the 4th day. He came without invitation, which was the custom in a settlement where a widow's survival was everyone's calculation. Bourne was the town blacksmith. He had worked iron for 30 years, patched boilers for the railroad spur, and buried his own wife to fever 11 years earlier. He was not cruel. He was precise, and precision, delivered without kindness, can cut just as clean. He walked the barn slowly. He pressed his palm against the south wall and felt daylight through the gaps. He crouched beside the stove and opened the firebox door, looked at the grate, closed it. He measured the distance from the stove to the far wall by counting his own boot lengths. Then he stood in the center of the building and looked up at the ridge beam 30 feet above, where every scrap of warm air would climb and vanish. "You have barn volume," Bourne said. "You have cabin iron. You have maybe 1.5 cords of mixed wood, most of it green, and your girls are sleeping farther from the fire than any man would stable a calf." Minnie said nothing. "I can tell you what this needs," Bourne said. "It needs a lower ceiling. It needs a second wall inside to cut the room in half. It needs 4 more cords, seasoned, and even then you are overfiring that stove past its rating every night. What it really needs is a proper boiler and pipe system, cast iron radiators, and a man who knows steam fitting." He paused. "You can afford none of that." "I know," Minnie said. "A bigger stove costs what you have in that jar, and then some. The lumber for a partition wall is $8 if Creed sells it to you without interest, which he will not. And stacking green wood against a drafty barn wall does not season it. It rots it." "I know," Minnie said again. Bourne looked at the far end of the barn where Minnie had pushed 2 straw ticks together on a plank platform and hung a wool blanket from a nail as a curtain. That was where the girls slept. It was 32 feet from the stove. "If that seam of yours holds through December, which it will because it is a stove, not a pipe, then your real problem begins in January," Bourne said. "January does not care about courage. It cares about heat per cubic foot, and you have the wrong ratio by a factor of 5. He left a quarter cord of cut birch by the door. He did not say goodbye. He said, "Move those girls closer to the stove and build a bed shelf. It will not fix the problem, but it will slow it down." Minnie did not move the girls. She stood in the doorway and watched Bourne's cart diminish on the road, and then she walked to the far end of the barn and placed her hand against the wall. The wood was cold. Not winter cold, October cold. The kind that whispers what is coming. She counted the facts. 40 feet of air between the stove and her daughters, 1.5 cords of mixed wood, a third of it still green. $12, no team, no timber rights, no labor credit. A stove that could warm a 10 by 12 cabin if the walls were tight and the ceiling low, now asked to heat a space 6 times that volume with a roof that pulled warmth upward like a chimney. She needed 6 cords minimum to burn through winter at the rate the barn demanded. She had 1.5. She needed a ceiling 8 feet high. She had one at 20. She needed walls within arm's reach of the stove. She had walls 32 feet away. The math did not work. It could not work. Every calculation she ran ended the same way. Not enough fuel, not enough iron, not enough money, not enough time. And the frost was already on the grass at dawn. The memory came on the 5th morning, while she knelt beside the stove, thawing a bucket of water for the girls' washing. She held the bucket near the iron side and watched the ice soften closest to the heat. The warmth did not travel. 3 inches from the stove wall, the water was lukewarm. 6 inches out, it was still cold. The air above the bucket shimmered and climbed straight up toward the rafters. Heat rose. Everyone knew that. Heat rose and spread and thinned and vanished in the volume of a building that had no business holding a family. But Minnie had seen heat do something else once. She was 11 years old, barefoot on packed dirt, standing beside her father in a shed behind their rented house in Seneca County. Her father repaired distilling equipment for the farmers who made whiskey for barter and for nerve. He was not a distiller himself. He was a coppersmith by accident, a man who had learned to braze and patch because the work was there, and the alternative was plowing someone else's field. The still he was mending that day had a copper worm, a coiled tube that ran from the pot head down through a barrel of cold water. Mash boiled in the pot. Vapor rose, entered the copper worm, and traveled its length. At the far end, the vapor met cool copper, collapsed back to liquid, and dripped into a jug. Her father had pulled the worm free of the cooling barrel to check a seam. He held it up in the air, and Minnie reached for it because the copper looked dull and harmless. Her finger jerked back. The metal was hot, not warm, hot enough to sting. And not just near the pot. The entire length of the tube carried heat, even the end that had been sitting in cold water moments before. "Steam is fast," her father said. His knuckles were black with soot. The shed smelled of mash and hot copper, sweet and sharp. "Hot air is lazy. It goes up because it is lighter and it takes its time about it. But vapor in a pipe that moves. It moves because it wants to be somewhere cooler, and it gives its heat away when it gets there." He pointed at the far end of the worm, where tiny beads of condensed liquid ran down the inside of the greenish copper, back toward the pot. "See that? The liquid comes home. Vapor runs out, gives up its heat, turns back to water, and the water runs home by its own weight. As long as the path slopes right, it never stops." Minnie had filed this away the way children file things, without knowing it, without naming it, without any sense that it might matter. Now, kneeling beside a stove that could not reach her children, she felt the memory surface like a coin turning over in her hand. Vapor moved heat, not slowly, like warm air drifting upward, fast, through a pipe. The vapor ran to the cool end and gave up its heat there. Then the liquid ran home by gravity, and the cycle started again. She looked at the bucket. 3 inches of warmth, then cold, then 30 feet of nothing, and her daughters at the end of it. She looked at the stove. She thought, what if the heat did not have to travel through the air at all? What if she gave it a road? The idea was not elegant. It was not even fully formed. She saw it in pieces, a copper tube long enough to reach from the stove to the bed end, sealed, with water inside, the hot end low, near the stove, the cool end high, near the girls. Vapor would form at the hot end, race through the tube, hit the cooler copper near the bed, release its heat, collapse back to water, and the water would slide downhill back to the hot end to boil again. Not a boiler, not a radiator system, not a thing with valves and fittings and a steam engineer's certificate, just a sealed copper pipe with water inside, tilted right, with one end in the fire's heat and the other end where her children slept. It sounded insane. It sounded like the only idea she had. She stood up, dried her hands on her apron, and walked to the far corner of the barn where Thomas had stacked the salvage from 2 abandoned claims, broken harness, rusted tools, and coiled beneath a pile of mildewed rope, a length of heavy copper tubing, 26 feet of it, with a 1/4-inch wall, pulled from an abandoned still that someone had dismantled for the copper value and then never collected. Minnie lifted the tube. It was heavy. The surface was green with patina, dented in 2 places but uncracked. She held it up and sighted down the bore. Clear. She carried it to the stove and laid it on the ground, one end near the firebox, the other aimed toward her daughter's bed platform. She crouched and poured a cup of water on the ground beside the tube, watching which way it ran. The barn floor had a natural fall toward the south wall. If she raised the bed end by 16 inches and kept the fire end low, gravity would return the condensate without pumps, without valves, without anything she could not build. The tube was not long enough to reach the full 32 feet, but if she moved the bed platform 6 feet closer and angled the tube along the wall, 26 feet of copper could bridge the gap between fire and sleep. She needed to seal both ends. She needed an expansion space for steam pressure, a bulge or bulb at one end where pressure could breathe without blowing a seam. She needed a way to mount the fire end near the stove's heat without jamming raw copper into open coals. She needed brackets to hold the pitch steady, and she needed a guard at the bed end so the girls could not touch hot metal in the night. She needed skills she did not have, but the physics, the part her father had shown her in a shed in Seneca County, the part about vapor and gravity and heat finding a path, that she understood. Ada Mercer came by that afternoon. Ada was Minnie's nearest neighbor, a homesteader's wife who had survived 3 Plains winters and had opinions about all of them. She was not unkind. She was practical in the way that frontier women were practical, which meant she could calculate the distance between hope and death faster than any man she knew. Minnie showed her the copper tube laid out on the barn floor. Heat goes up, Ada said. Everybody knows that. Water freezes. Everybody knows that too. And pipes burst when the water inside them freezes. You're mixing all 3 and calling it hope. The water will not freeze, Minnie said. The fire end stays hot. The water boils to steam inside the tube. The steam runs to the cool end, gives its heat there, turns back to water, and the water slides home. Slides home, Ada repeated, by gravity, if the pitch is right. Ada looked at the tube. She looked at the stove. She looked at the bed platform 32 feet away. How do you know the steam does not just sit there? Because I have seen it move, Minnie said. In a still, in a copper worm, the vapor does not sit. It runs toward cold. That is what vapor does. A still is 3 feet long and built by a man who knows copper. The principle does not change with length. Ada folded her arms. Minnie, you have $12, 2 girls, and winter coming. Every hour you spend on this copper pipe is an hour you're not spending cutting wood. If this thing does not work, you have lost the time and you still have the cold. If I spend every hour cutting wood, Minnie said, I still do not have enough. I need 6 cords. I have less than 2. Even if I could cut 4 cords by myself in the time left, which I cannot. The barn eats heat faster than that stove can make it. The wood is not the problem. The distance is the problem. She picked up the cup of water and poured it along the tube. It ran from the high end to the low end without pooling. That is what the steam will do, she said, except it will carry heat with it. Ada watched the water run. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, I will bring blankets for the girls. Whatever else happens, they need blankets. She left. She did not say the idea would work. She did not say it would fail. She said what a practical woman says when she sees another woman's odds and cannot improve them. She offered wool. Word spread the way it always did in a settlement of 40 families, by wagon seat, store counter, and well pump. By the end of the week, half the township knew that the Hale widow was laying copper pipe in her barn and claiming she could move heat 30 feet without a boiler. Silas Creed heard about it at his hardware store. Creed sold lumber, nails, stove parts, and credit. He held notes on 4 local claims, including the disputed Hale property, and he had been calculating since Thomas's death how quickly Minnie would exhaust her resources and sell. A distressed claims sale meant Creed could buy low, resell high, and call it commerce. A widow who found a way to survive the winter was a widow who would not sell. Creed came to the barn on a Tuesday. He did not come alone. He brought Phelps, who clerked for him, and he brought his voice, which carried the way a man's voice carries when he has decided that volume is the same as authority. I heard something remarkable, Creed said from the doorway. He did not step inside. He looked at the copper tube on the floor, the stove, the distant bed platform, and Minnie kneeling beside a charcoal mark she had drawn on the planks to track the slope. I heard you are building a heater out of a whiskey worm. It is a copper tube, Minnie said without looking up. A barn is a barn, Mrs. Hale. If you could not afford walls, I do not see how boiling a pipe gets you closer to a house. Minnie said nothing. She checked the mark with a cup of water, watching the direction of flow. People are talking, Creed continued. He said it the way a man says it when he wants the subject to know that the talk is unfavorable. They are saying you have built an illegal still heater and you're going to burn down your brother-in-law's barn and take the girls with it. People can walk over and look at it, Minnie said. I am looking at it. What I see is a widow with $12 playing at steam fitting. He turned to Phelps and smiled the way a man smiles when he wants a witness to the joke. What I see is a woman who should be talking to me about terms on the claim before the ground freezes and the property value drops to nothing. Minnie looked up. The property is in probate, she said. The claim is not yours to term. Not yet, Creed said. He stepped 1 foot inside the door and looked up at the ridge beam. A barn is a barn, Mrs. Hale. You can lay copper in it from wall to wall, and it will still be a barn in January. I have wintered in buildings half this size with twice the stove and still lost feeling in my feet by February. This is not a heating problem. This is a mathematics problem, and the mathematics say you should be settling your husband's account while there is still something to settle with. He let that sit. Phelps wrote something in a pocket ledger. Creed adjusted his hat, nodded once as if confirming his own authority, and walked back to his cart. The barn was quiet except for the sound of wind through the south wall gaps and the small voice of the 4-year-old asking from the bed platform if she could come down. Minnie sat with the charcoal marks and the copper tube and the $12 and the knowledge that Creed was not wrong about the risk. If the seam failed, if pressure built inside the tube and found a weak point, superheated steam could vent into a closed space where her daughters slept. She was building either a heater or a weapon. She needed someone who knew the difference. Minnie started work the next morning before the girls woke. She could not wait for expertise she did not have. Winter was coming on a schedule that did not respect her doubts. The first task was preparing the fire end. She could not shove raw copper into the coals. The tube would oxidize, weaken, and the temperature would be impossible to regulate. She needed a sleeve, an iron jacket that sat near the firebox, close enough to conduct heat into the copper, but shielded enough that the tube never touched open flame. She found the sleeve in Thomas's salvage pile, a short section of iron pipe 6 inches in diameter, cracked at one end but solid for 16 inches of its length. She filed the crack, smooth, packed river clay around the cracked end to block drafts, and fitted the copper tube's fire end inside the iron sleeve with clay packing between them. It was crude. It looked like something a child would build. But when she lit the stove and held her hand near the iron sleeve, she felt heat moving into the copper within minutes. Not much. Not yet. The tube was empty. The far end was open, and there was no water inside to carry anything. But the principle was alive. Iron took heat from the fire. Iron gave heat to copper. Copper would give heat to water. Water would become steam. Steam would travel. The chain was real. She just had to close it. The second task was the far end. She needed to seal the tube, but not completely. Steam under heat expands. A perfectly rigid seal with no room for expansion would turn the tube into a bomb. Her father had never taught her this directly, but she had seen him leave space in vessels, had watched him shape bulges into copper where pressure needed room to breathe. She took the last 8 inches of the tube and worked them with a mallet, widening the bore into a rough bulb, a teardrop-shaped expansion at the cool end where steam could collect, condense, and pressure could ease without splitting a seam. The copper was thick enough to take the shaping without cracking, though her hands ached and her mallet strikes were uneven. The result was ugly, functional and ugly. The kind of work that makes a craftsman wince and a desperate woman nod. She needed to braze the seams. She needed to seal the fire end where the copper met the iron sleeve. She needed the bed end bulb soldered shut and pressure tight. She did not know how to braze copper to hold under steam. The temperature dropped 4 degrees overnight. November was running out of patience. Minnie stacked what wood she had against the south wall, calculated consumption at the current burn rate, and arrived at a number that made her sit down on the cold ground. At the rate the stove consumed fuel to keep even the stove corner livable, her wood supply would last until the second week of January, maybe the third if she burned cold and let the far end go to ice. The blizzard season on the northern plains ran through March. She was 6 weeks short. Even if the copper tube worked perfectly, she still needed more fuel than she had. The tube was not a replacement for fire. It was a way to make the fire she could afford reach the place it needed to go. But she could not make the fire she could afford reach anywhere until she could seal copper under steam pressure. She needed Bourne's forge. She needed his anvil face and his brazing rods and his expertise. And Bourne had already told her she was housing children in a livestock barn with the wrong math. She spent the next 2 days preparing what she could without the forge. She stripped 3 boards from the loft and sawed them into guard slats, working with a crosscut saw meant for 2 hands that she muscled alone until blisters rose on both palms and broke before noon. She bent iron straps from Thomas's salvage into rough mounting brackets, hammering them over a stump with a hand sledge until her shoulders burned. She repositioned the bed platform 6 feet closer to the center of the barn, dragging the plank frame across the dirt floor, with the girls sitting on it because the 4-year-old cried when asked to stand in the cold. By the second evening, her hands were cracked and bleeding. She wrapped them in torn cotton and kept working. The girls ate cornmeal mush for dinner because she had not had time to cook anything else. The 7-year-old watched her mother file copper by lamplight and said nothing, which was worse than questions. On a Thursday, in late November, with the temperature below freezing for the 3rd straight morning, Minnie wrapped her daughters in every blanket Ada had brought, left them with Ada's oldest girl, and carried the copper tube and iron sleeve to Bourne's smithy, on a hand cart she had made from a salvaged axle and 2 barn boards. She had not asked permission. She laid the pieces on Bourne's workbench and unrolled the charcoal sketch she had made, the barn floor plan, the slope marks, the fire end with the iron sleeve, the cool end with the expansion bulb, the pitch measured by water cup, the bed platform repositioned 6 feet closer, the guard slats she planned from loft boards. Bourne looked at the sketch for a long time. "You measured the slope," he said, "with a cup of water 7 times. And the bulb, you shaped that?" "With a mallet. It is not pretty." "Pretty does not hold steam." He picked up the expansion end and turned it in his hand. He ran a thumb along the seam where the widening began. "This is where it will fail, if it fails. The transition from narrow bore to wide. That is where stress concentrates." "I know," Minnie said. "That is why I am here." Bourne set the piece down. He looked at the sketch again. He looked at Minnie. "I told you to move the girls closer to the stove," he said. "Moving them closer does not fix the problem. It delays it. In January, even the stove corner will not be enough if I'm burning green wood in a building this size. And this fixes it? This moves the heat. It does not make more heat. It takes what the stove produces and carries it to where the girls sleep, instead of letting it rise into 30 feet of empty loft." Bourne was quiet. Outside, a horse stamped. The forge ticked as it cooled. "I will not braze this," Bourne said, "unless I see your slope plan work on a test length first. And I will not let you fire it until I have inspected every seam myself." "Agreed," Minnie said. "And if I find a flaw, anything, any place where the metal has thinned or the joint has not taken, I pull it apart and you are done. No argument." "Agreed." Bourne nodded once. He pulled a brazing rod from the rack and lit the forge. That was not approval. It was not faith. It was a blacksmith's way of saying, "Show me." Minnie had come with measurements, not prayers, and measurements were the only currency Bourne recognized. If you have ever been told that what you were building was impossible by someone who had not seen your measurements, tell us in the comments. Because what Minnie built next would either prove her right or kill her children, and the answer was not going to come from argument. It was going to come from copper, heat, and one long night. The first brazing took 3 hours. Bourne worked the fire end joint where copper met the iron sleeve. He cleaned the metal bright with a wire brush, fluxed the joint, heated it evenly with the forge tip, and ran the brazing rod until silver-white metal pooled and wicked into the seam. Minnie watched every motion. She asked why he heated the base metal first instead of the rod. She asked why the flux mattered. She asked what happened to a joint brazed over dirty copper. "It holds until it does not," Bourne said. "Then it opens under pressure, and you learn the lesson the hard way." "I cannot afford the hard way." "Nobody can. That is why I am showing you the right way." He finished the fire end joint, turned the assembly over, and started on the expansion bulb. This was harder. The transition from narrow bore to the mallet-widened bulb was uneven, and the copper had thinned at the stress point he had identified earlier. "This needs reinforcement," Bourne said. "A collar, a ring of thicker copper brazed around the transition to distribute the load." "I do not have thicker copper." Bourne reached under his bench and pulled out a section of heavy copper stock, a scrap from a locomotive fitting he had replaced 2 years earlier. He cut a ring, shaped it cold on the anvil, fitted it around the transition, and brazed it in place with the same careful, even heat. He did not say why he had the scrap. He did not say he was helping. He said, "Your expansion end would have lasted 1 night, maybe 2. Now it will last the winter if your slope holds and you do not overfire." The sky through the smithy door had turned the color of iron. Wind pushed dry leaves across the yard. Somewhere south, Weather was building that had not yet earned a name, but would, in 2 months, earn one that parents would not forget. Minnie loaded the brazed assembly onto her handcart. 26 feet of copper tube, iron-sleeved at the fire end, bulbed and collared at the cool end, and sealed at both terminals with joints a 30-year blacksmith had inspected and approved. Now she had to mount it, pitch it, fill it, and test it before the cold proved whether she had built a heater or a coffin that hissed. The walk home took 40 minutes. The wind had shifted north while she was inside the smithy, and the air tasted different, drier, sharper, carrying the mineral edge of real cold instead of autumn's bluff. She pulled her shawl tighter with one hand and steadied the cart with the other. The copper tube rattled against the boards with each rut in the road. 26 feet of metal and hope, and the seams were still untested under actual steam. Her daughters would be asleep by now. Ada's girl would have fed them. The barn would be dark, and the stove cold because no one was there to feed it. She walked faster. The temperature dropped the entire way. She mounted the tube that night by lamplight. The iron straps she had bent over the stump went into the wall studs at measured intervals, every 4 feet along the run, angled to hold the copper at a continuous downward pitch from the bed end toward the fire end. She checked the slope with her cup of water 3 times before she was satisfied. The water ran clean from high to low without pooling at any bracket. The fire end sleeve sat in a cradle of river clay and scrap iron, positioned 4 inches from the stove's side plate. Not touching. Close enough for the iron to conduct heat into the copper, far enough that the stove could be fed and raked without disturbing the assembly. She packed clay around the base of the cradle to hold it steady and wired the sleeve to a wall stud as a secondary anchor. The bed end, with its ugly expansion bulb and Bourne's reinforcement collar, hung 16 inches above the repositioned bed platform. She nailed guard slats from the loft boards into a rough cage around it. 3 slats on the wall side, 2 on the open side, spaced wide enough for heat to radiate, but tight enough that a child's hand could not reach the copper in the dark. By midnight, the assembly was mounted. 26 feet of sealed copper running along the south wall of the barn, pitched at a steady grade, sleeved at the hot end, bulbed at the cool end, and guarded where the girls would sleep. It looked like nothing anyone would recognize as a heater. It looked like a mistake someone had made with plumbing and then nailed to a wall. She had not yet filled it with water. That was the step that turned copper into either a heater or a hazard, and she was not going to take it alone. Not because she was afraid, because she was not stupid. A sealed vessel under heat with water inside behaved according to rules she understood in principle but had never tested in practice. If the fill was wrong, too much water, too little airspace, pressure would build with nowhere to go. If the pitch was wrong by even a small margin, condensate would pool at a low point and block the vapor's path. If the seams were not as strong as Bourne believed, the weakest joint would find out first. She needed someone who had worked with steam, not a blacksmith who shaped iron in brazed seams. A man who understood what happened inside a closed system when fire met water. She did not know that man yet. He found her. Amos Redden arrived 3 days later on a mule he had borrowed from the livery. He was 56 years old, half lame in his left leg from a boiler shop accident that had driven a rivet through his boot 12 years earlier, and retired from the railroad in the way that men retired from the railroad in that era, which meant he had been let go when his limp slowed him past usefulness and given nothing for the years that had cost him the leg. He had heard about the copper tube from Bourne, who mentioned it the way a blacksmith mentions something that interests him against his own judgment. Bourne had said, "The Hale widow has a sealed copper line pitched from her stove to her children's bed, and either she knows something about vapor return, or she is going to learn something about pressure failure." Amos had spent 31 years maintaining steam systems for the Northern Pacific Spur Line. He had repaired locomotive boilers, replaced pipe runs in depot heating systems, and once spent 3 weeks rebuilding a thermosiphon loop in a station house that had frozen, burst, and flooded the telegraph office. He knew what water did under heat in a closed tube the way Bourne knew what iron did under a hammer. He tied his mule to the barn post and stood in the doorway for a full minute, looking at the copper line along the wall. He did not speak. He followed the run with his eyes from the iron sleeve at the stove to the expansion bulb at the bed end. He looked at the pitch. He looked at the brackets. He looked at the guard cage. Then he walked the length of the tube, touching each bracket, pressing his thumb against the seams, checking the slope with a spirit level he pulled from his coat pocket. "Who brazed this?" Amos asked. "Bourne." "Bourne does good firework." He tapped the reinforcement collar at the bulb transition. "This was his idea?" "He said the transition would fail without it." He was right. Amos crouched beside the fire end and examined the iron sleeve. He pulled the clay packing away from one side, looked at the gap between copper and iron, and put the clay back. "Your clearance is good. How did you decide on 4 inches from the stoveplate?" "I held my hand there. 4 inches was hot enough to spit on and hear it hiss. 3 inches was too hot to hold still. 5 was barely warm." Amos looked at her. "That is not a bad method," he said. "It is an ugly method, and it would get you laughed out of any machine shop on the Northern Pacific. But the answer it gave you is close to right." He stood up, which took effort because of the leg. "You have not filled it yet," he said. "No." "Why not?" "Because I do not know how much water to put in. Too much, and there is no room for steam to form. Too little, and the fire end dries out and the copper overheats." Amos nodded slowly. He looked at the tube, the way a man looks at a sentence written in a language he can read but the author cannot. "I will show you how to fill it," he said, "and I will show you how to fire it the first time. And if it works, I will show you what to listen for so you know the difference between a healthy tube and one that is about to speak its last word. But I am not doing this because I think you need saving. I am doing this because you measured the pitch before you asked for help, and in 31 years of steam work, I have never seen a homesteader who thought about return fall before they thought about lighting the match." That was how Amos Redden became the second person in Hadley Township who believed the copper tube might work. Not because he was kind, because he was precise, and he recognized precision in someone else. They filled the tube the next morning. Amos taught by doing, not by lecturing, and the first lesson was the fill. He had Minnie seal the bed end cap with a temporary plug, then pour water through the fire end opening using a tin funnel, counting the cups aloud. "Stop," Amos said after the 14th cup. "That is barely a third full." "That is correct. You want room. Vapor needs volume to travel. If you fill this tube past 40%, you are building a water column, not a steam circuit. The water sits there, heats slowly, and does nothing useful. A third full gives the vapor room to form, rise, run, condense, and fall back." "How do you know a third?" "Because I have rebuilt 16 thermosiphon loops and watched 4 of them fail because someone thought more water meant more heat." He sealed the fire end cap with a final braze that Bourne had left open for this purpose, a small fill port that Amos closed with a copper plug and silver solder. "There, sealed. From this moment, what is inside stays inside unless a seam fails or you drill it out." "What happens now?" "Now you fire the stove, gently, not like you are trying to heat the barn, like you're trying to warm a sick child. Low fire, steady, and you listen." Minnie fed the stove with split birch, the quarter cord Bourne had left, dry and clean burning. She kept the draft half closed. The iron warmed, the sleeve conducted, and within 15 minutes Amos held his palm near the copper tube at the midpoint of its run, 13 feet from the stove. "There," he said. "Feel that." Minnie put her hand where his had been. The copper was warm, not hot, warm. 13 feet from the fire, through a sealed tube, with no boiler, no pump, no valves. "The vapor is moving," Amos said. "It formed at the fire end, traveled through the bore, and it has given up heat as it goes. When it reaches the cool end, it will condense and the liquid will run home by gravity. The cycle will continue as long as the fire holds and the pitch stays true." They walked together to the bed end. Amos put his hand on the expansion bulb. He waited. 30 seconds. A minute. "Not yet," he said. "Give it time. The tube is cold. The copper has to warm along its whole length before the cycle stabilizes." They waited. The girls played near the stove, the older one stacking kindling into a house that the younger one knocked down. The barn was quiet except for the fire's tick and the wind outside. After 6 minutes, Amos touched the bulb again. His face changed. "Come here," he said. Minnie put her hand on the copper above the guard cage. It was warm, distinctly, unmistakably warm, warmer than the air around it, warmer than the wall behind it. 26 feet from the stove on the far side of a building the size of a livestock barn, the copper was radiating heat into the space where her daughter slept. She did not say anything. She kept her hand there. The warmth was modest, nothing like standing beside a stove, but it was present where no warmth had any right to be, and it was steady, and it was growing. "Listen," Amos said. She listened. From inside the tube came a faint sound, a low, continuous murmur, like water moving through a creek bed under ice. That was the condensate returning. Vapor out, liquid back. The circuit was alive. "That sound," Amos said, "is what healthy circulation sounds like. Remember it. If the sound stops, the circulation is stopped. If the sound changes to a knock or a hammer, there is a water slug trapped at a low point, and you need to check your pitch. If the sound becomes a high whistle, you are overfiring and the pressure is climbing past what the seams want to hold. Low murmur is good, silence is bad. Anything loud is dangerous." Minnie memorized the sound. She would hear it in her sleep for the rest of the winter. The days that followed were a countdown measured in firewood and falling temperatures. Minnie ran the tube every night. She learned its rhythms. She learned that a half-load of dry birch in the stove produced enough heat to keep the bed end warm through the first 5 hours. But by the 3rd hour before dawn, the circulation slowed as the fire died, and the copper cooled from the far end backward, like a sentence being erased word by word. She learned to wake at 2 in the morning and feed the stove without overfiring. Amos had taught her the rule. A steam device fails when fed like a forge instead of held like a living circulation. Too much heat did not mean more warmth at the far end. It meant faster vapor, higher pressure, and stress on every joint Bourne had sealed. Moderation. In a barn where everything screamed for more fire, the tube demanded less. She also learned what the tube could not do. It could not heat the barn. It could not warm the air in the loft or stop frost from forming on the north wall. The rafters stayed cold. The door still leaked. What the tube could do was deliver heat to a specific zone, the curtained sleeping alcove at the bed end, with an efficiency that hot air could never match in a space this large. The girls slept under blankets in air that stayed above freezing, while the rest of the barn dropped to temperatures that made nail heads white. By the 2nd week of December, Minnie had burned through half her remaining wood. She had less than 3/4 of a cord left, but the burn rate had dropped. She was no longer overfiring the stove to push heat into unreachable space. She was firing it moderately and letting the copper carry the heat where it mattered. The savings were real, not dramatic. Enough. Bourne came back on December 14th. He did not announce himself. He walked to the bed end, put his hand near the guard cage, and stood there for 30 seconds. "It is warm," Bourne said. "It has been warm for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of mild cold." He looked at her. "December is not January. You have not tested this in real weather." "I know. And your wood is low." "I know that too. One safe evening proves nothing, Mrs. Hale. One safe month of moderate cold proves almost nothing. What proves it is a night when the temperature drops past anything that stove was built for, and the seams hold, and the pitch holds, and the fire holds, and your girls wake up alive." He left. He was not wrong. He was not cruel. He was accurate, and accuracy, when it confirms your deepest fear, feels exactly like cruelty. Ada came by the next day. She brought a sack of dried beans and a jar of rendered fat. She looked at the copper tube, touched it, pulled her hand back. "It is warm," Ada said. "Everyone keeps saying that like they expected it to be cold." "I expected it to be cold." Ada sat on the edge of the bed platform. The 4-year-old climbed into her lap. "Minnie, I have lived through 3 winters here. The bad ones do not announce themselves. They come on a day that feels like spring and turn into something else by supper time. If your pipe works in a slow freeze, that is good, that is useful. But there is a kind of cold that comes to these plains that is not a freeze. It is a killing, and I do not know if copper and water can survive a killing." "Neither do I," Minnie said. That was the most honest thing either of them had said. Outside, the sky was a blue so deep it looked like it might crack. The wind was calm. The temperature was 21 degrees, cold but manageable. On the northern horizon, nothing moved. No cloud, no front, no warning. The warning would come later. It would come as warmth. The first week of January 1888 arrived with a lie. The temperatures rose. Snow softened. Children went to school without heavy coats. Farmers who had been holed up since November walked their property lines and talked about an early thaw. The air on January 11th felt like late March, 40 degrees, south wind, a mildness so total that people opened doors they had not opened in weeks and stood in their yards breathing air that did not hurt. Minnie did not trust it. She had no meteorological reason for her suspicion. She had instinct, and instinct told her that plains weather did not give gifts in January without taking something back. She filled the stove. She checked the copper tube's pitch with her water cup. She made sure the guard slats were tight. She stacked her remaining wood, just over half a cord, inside the barn door where it could not get wet. She closed the barn and drew the bed curtain and put the girls to sleep early. The 7-year-old asked why they were going to bed when it was still warm. "Because warm does not last," Minnie said. The 4-year-old had been coughing since morning. By nightfall, the cough had deepened and her forehead was hot to the touch. Not dangerously hot. The kind of hot that means a child's body is fighting something, and the fight will get worse before it gets better. Minnie sat beside the stove and listened to the copper tube's murmur and her daughter's cough, and waited for what the sky was going to do. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 62 degrees in 11 hours. It began in the early afternoon. The south wind died as if someone had closed a door. For 10 minutes, the air was perfectly still. Then the north wind arrived, and it did not arrive gradually. It came as a wall. Minnie heard it before she felt it, a roar from the northwest like a freight train running without rails. And then the barn shook, and the temperature began to fall so fast that the tin cup of water she had left on the windowsill grew a skin of ice while she watched. By 3 o'clock, the mildness was gone. By 4, the air was below 0. By 5, the wind was driving snow horizontally through every gap in the barn siding, and the temperature was still falling. This was the storm that would be called the children's blizzard, because it struck in the middle of a school day when children were walking home in clothes chosen for the morning's warmth. Across the northern plains from Dakota Territory to Nebraska, people who had been comfortable at noon were fighting for their lives by dark. Minnie's first crisis was the door. The wind packed snow against the south side of the barn in a drift that rose 2 feet in the first hour. The leather hinges held, but the gap beneath the door became a channel for wind-driven snow that piled inside on the dirt floor. She stuffed it with straw and a folded horse blanket and piled salvage against it. But the wind found seams she had not known existed and pushed cold air through the wall gaps like fingers. The stove fought. She fed it dry birch at the rate Amos had taught her, moderate, steady, not a forge fire, and the iron glowed dull red along the firebox. The stove corner temperature held, but the barn was bleeding heat through every crack, and the volume of cold air pouring through the gaps was pushing the warm air upward into the loft faster than the stove could replace it. The copper tube murmured. She checked the bed end. Warm. The bulb was radiating heat into the curtained alcove, and the blankets were holding it. The girls were wrapped together under wool. The 4-year-old's cough was worse. Her forehead was hotter. By 7 o'clock, the temperature outside had dropped past 20 below zero and was still falling. The nails in the north wall wore white collars of frost. The salvage pile near the door was dusted with blown snow. Minnie's breath made clouds that did not dissolve. They hung in the air and drifted upward in layers, like something the cold was building. She checked the tube again, still warm at the bed end. The murmur was steady. The fire was moderate. The pitch was holding. Then, at 8:30, the murmur stopped. Minnie was at the stove when she noticed. The absence of sound was louder than the sound itself, a silence inside the tube where there should have been the low creek water note of returning condensate. She touched the copper at the midpoint. Warm, but not as warm as an hour ago. She moved to the bed end. The bulb was cooling. Something had changed. She ran her hand along the tube from stove to bed, feeling for temperature variations, and found it at the 14-foot mark. The copper was hot on the stove side of that point, and cool on the bedside. The circulation had broken. Something was blocking the vapor's path or preventing the condensate's return. She traced the brackets with her fingers in the dim light. The fourth bracket from the stove, the one she had mounted into a wall stud near the center of the barn, had shifted. The stud itself had moved. The wind pressure on the south wall had flexed the planking, and the flex had pulled the stud a 1/4 inch inward, tilting the bracket and creating a dip in the copper line. A low point. A trap. Condensate was pooling at the dip instead of running home. The pool blocked the vapor path. The circulation was dead. The bed end was cooling. The 4-year-old was feverish. The temperature outside was past 25 below, and the wind was screaming. Minnie needed to re-level the tube. She needed to lift the bracket, shim the stud, and restore the pitch so the condensate could drain and the circuit could restart. She needed to do this in the dark, in a barn that was losing heat by the minute without disturbing a sealed copper tube that was still hot at one end and pressurized with steam. She could not do it alone. The barn door banged. Not wind, a fist. Someone was outside, hammering on the planks, and the voice that came through the gap was raw and half lost in the gale. Amos Redden had walked a 1/4 mile through the blizzard to check on her. His mule had refused to leave the livery. He had come on foot, half lame, with a lantern that the wind killed before he reached the barn. His coat was caked white. His bad leg was dragging. He had come because he knew what the copper tube was, and he knew what the storm was, and he knew that a 1/4 inch shift in pitch could turn a working heater into a dead one on the worst night of the year. Minnie pulled the salvage away from the door and hauled him inside. He stood shaking in the stove corner for 2 minutes, hands over the iron, and then he said, "Where did the sound stop?" 14 feet. The fourth bracket shifted. The wall flexed. "Show me." They went together. Amos held a tallow candle while Minnie pointed to the bracket. He ran his thumb along the copper and found the low point. He pressed the tube gently upward, and they both heard it. A gurgle, then a rush, then the murmur returned. Condensate had drained past the low point, and the circuit was alive again, but the bracket needed to hold. Amos pulled a wooden shim from his coat pocket. He carried shims the way other men carried knives, because 31 years of steam work had taught him that level was the first thing to fail and the last thing people checked. He wedged the shim between the bracket and the stud, restoring the pitch. Minnie drove a second nail through the bracket into solid wood above the stud. Amos tested the slope with his spirit level by candlelight. "It will hold," he said, "but you need to check every bracket in the morning. If this wall flexes again, you shim again. The tube does not forgive low points." They returned to the stove. The murmur was steady now, that low, continuous note that meant vapor was running. Condensate was falling, and heat was traveling 26 feet through sealed copper to the place where 2 children slept. "If you are still here, if you need to know whether these girls survive this night, then stay with us, because the storm is not done, and what happens in the next 3 hours will determine whether this copper tube was a heater or a death sentence." Hit subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. The peak came at midnight. The temperature outside reached 34 degrees below zero. The wind gusted past 50 miles an hour and drove snow through gaps in the siding that Minnie had stuffed and restuffed. The stove consumed birch at a rate that made her count the remaining splits. She had enough for 2 more nights at this burn rate. After that, she would be feeding the stove green cottonwood and praying. Amos sat in the stove corner and watched the tube. He listened. Every few minutes he would hold up one finger. "The murmur is good," or tilt his hand. "The pitch needs watching." He did not speak. He listened to the copper, the way a doctor listens to a chest, parsing the sounds for the ones that meant trouble. At 1 o'clock, the 4-year-old's fever spiked. She woke crying, her skin blazing, her cough a deep bark that shook her small body. Minnie went to the bed end. The curtained alcove was warm, not comfortable, not summer, but warm enough that the child's sweat was drying instead of freezing. The water bucket beside the bed was liquid, not warm, liquid. In a barn where the north wall wore frost-like paint and the loft air would kill exposed skin in minutes, the sleeping zone held. Minnie wet a cloth in the bucket and pressed it to her daughter's forehead. The 7-year-old was awake, watching, quiet, in the way that children go quiet when they understand more than they can say. "Is the pipe keeping us warm?" the 7-year-old asked. "Yes." "Is Nettie going to be all right?" "Yes," Minnie said, because some answers are not about truth. They are about what a child needs to hear at 1 o'clock in the morning in a blizzard. At the Henshaw claim 3/4 of a mile north, old Arvid Henshaw was fighting a different battle. His shack was 12 by 14 feet, small enough that his stove should have held it. But the storm had found the place where his stovepipe passed through the roof and torn the flashing loose, and now cold air was pouring down the pipe gap like water through a broken dam. Arvid stuffed rags into the gap and burned his last good wood and sat in a chair 3 feet from the stove and still could not stop shivering. By 2 in the morning, his fingers were white. By 3, he could not feel his feet. He was a 1/4 mile from death when a neighbor dragged him out at dawn and carried him to a house with a working chimney. Arvid Henshaw had a proper cabin. He had proper walls. He had a stove rated for the room. He lacked one thing, a way to keep heat where it mattered when the building's shell betrayed him. He had a heat source. He did not have a heat path. In the barn, the copper tube murmured. Vapor ran, condensate, fell. Heat arrived where it was sent. At 3 in the morning, the wind shifted east and the snow thickened into a white darkness, so total that Minnie could not see the stove from the bed end. She navigated by sound, the fires crackle from one direction, the tubes murmur from the other, a rope she had strung from stud to stud along the wall because she had imagined this exact darkness when she mounted the brackets. She fed the stove. She checked the brackets by feel. She returned to the bed end and held her daughter and waited. The storm broke at dawn. Not ended, broke. The wind eased from a scream to a moan. The snow thinned enough to see the wall. The temperature stopped falling and held at 31 below, which was still murderous but no longer getting worse. Minnie lifted the bed curtain. The 4-year-old was sleeping, her fever lower, her breathing rough but steady. The 7-year-old was asleep beside her, her face bare above the blanket, not curled against cold but open, relaxed, the face of a child who had slept warm. The water bucket beside the bed had not frozen. Minnie put her hand on the copper tube above the guard cage. It was warm. 26 feet from the stove, through sealed copper, past a bracket that had tried to fail and been shimmed back to true, the heat was still arriving. She sat on the edge of the bed platform and put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She was too tired to cry. She sat and breathed and listened to the murmur inside the copper and the wind outside the walls, and knew that she had built a thing that worked on the worst night she would ever face. Amos was asleep in the stove corner, his bad legs stretched toward the iron, his coat still white with snow. He had walked through a blizzard on a ruined leg to check a bracket. She would not forget that. She would carry that with her for the rest of her life. Not as debt, but as proof that competence, recognized by another who understood it, was worth walking into a storm for. The barn was still a barn. The rafters were still white. The north wall was still crusted with frost. The stove was still too small. The wood was still too scarce. But under the bed curtain at the far end, where no stove should have reached, the air was warm and the water was liquid, and the children were alive. The storm left 3 feet of snow on level ground and drifts twice that against south-facing walls. 2 people died in the township, a school teacher caught between the schoolhouse and her boarding room, and a freighter whose wagon overturned on the north road. Livestock losses were worse. The count would take weeks. Minnie dug out her barn door on the morning of January 13th and stood in light so bright off the snow that it made her eyes water. The world was white and still and 21 below zero, and she was alive, and her girls were alive, and the copper tube behind her was still murmuring. Bourne came first. He arrived on the 14th, after the road had been broken by a neighbor's ox team. He did not knock. He walked through the open door, past the stove, past the midpoint of the copper run where the shimmed bracket held true, and stopped at the bed end. He put his palm flat against the copper above the guard cage. He held it there. He looked at the frost line on the wall, a sharp edge where white stopped and bare wood began, exactly where the curtained alcove caught the tube's heat and held it. He looked at the water bucket beside the bed. Liquid. He looked at the bed platform where the blankets were folded back, where 2 children had slept through the worst night in 20 years of plains, weather with their faces bare. "I was wrong about what it was," Bourne said. His voice was quiet, not defeated, the voice of a man recalibrating something he thought he understood. "Not wrong about what bad metal can do. A weak seam under steam will kill as fast as I said it would. But this is not bad metal. This is a heater." "It is a path," Minnie said. "The stove makes the heat. The tube carries it." "I know what it is now." He ran his thumb along the reinforcement collar he had brazed 6 weeks earlier. "I have been working iron for 30 years, and I did not see this because I was thinking about boilers. boilers and radiators and systems that cost $500 and take a crew to install. I was not thinking about one woman with one tube and a pitch measured with a cup of water. He turned to face her. How many people know about this? Everyone who talked about it before the storm. So everyone. Then they will come. And when they come, you need to tell them what Amos told you about fill level and what I told you about seam work. Because if someone fills a tube to the top and puts it on a fire, they will not build a heater. They will build what I was afraid you were building. That was Bourne's conversion. It was not a surrender. It was a blacksmith recognizing that his expertise, seam discipline, metal integrity, pressure awareness, was not opposed to Minnie's idea. It was essential to it. He had been right about the danger. He had been wrong about the woman. Ada Mercer came the same afternoon. She brought her husband, Orrin, who had not spoken to Minnie since the copper tube, became town gossip because he considered the entire project an embarrassment to practical people. Ada walked the tube's length the way Bourne had, touching, feeling, following the heat from stove to bed. Orrin stood near the door with his arms crossed and said nothing. How warm does it get? Ada asked. Warm enough that the bucket does not freeze. Warm enough that the girls sleep bare-faced. Not warm enough that you would call it comfortable. But the difference between freezing and not freezing is the only difference that matters. How much water is inside? About a third of the tube's volume. Amos said more than that kills the circulation. How much pitch? 16 inches of rise over 26 feet of run, about 3/4 of an inch per foot, enough that the condensate runs home without pooling. Ada looked at the guard cage. How do you keep the children from touching it? The slats. And I told them. The 7-year-old understands. The 4-year-old knows the cage means hot. Orrin unfolded his arms. How much copper do you need? It was the first practical question he had asked about the project since it began, and Minnie understood what it meant. He was not curious. He was calculating. The Mercer claim had the same problem every claim on the plains had. Too much space, too little heat, too many hours between the stove and the far wall. The tube needs to be thick-walled, distillery copper or heavy plumbing stock. Thin copper will not hold under repeated heating and cooling cycles. The length depends on your distance. The pitch depends on your floor. And the seams must be brazed by someone who knows steam work, not soldered by someone who knows tin. Bourne, Orrin said. Bourne, Minnie agreed. They left. By sundown, Ada sent her oldest daughter back with a smoked ham and a note that said, "Thank you for not dying." Over the following 2 weeks, 9 families came to the barn. They came with questions, and the questions followed a pattern that told Minnie exactly how people think about heat when they have nearly lost to cold. The women asked about safety first. How close could the tube be to a sleeping child? What happened if a seam failed in the night? How did you know the difference between a healthy sound and a dangerous one? Could the tube explode? The men asked about construction first. What diameter tube? What wall thickness? How did you mount the brackets? Could iron pipe work instead of copper? Minnie answered every question by showing, not telling. She lit the stove, let the tube warm, and walked each visitor from fire end to bed end with their hand near the copper. She made them listen to the murmur. She showed them the shimmed bracket and explained what had happened during the blizzard and why a 1/4 inch of pitch change could kill the circulation. The Grindheim family came on a Tuesday. Knut Grindheim had nearly lost his youngest son to the blizzard. The boy had been in the barn with the cattle when the storm hit, and Knut had found him blue-lipped and stiff beside a frozen trough. The boy survived because Knut carried him to the stove and held him there for 6 hours, but the experience had broken something in Knut's understanding of winter. He had believed that walls and fire were enough. Now he knew they were not. He stood at the bed end of Minnie's barn with his hand on the warm copper and his face working through something complicated. I have a sleeping loft, Knut said. The stove is on the ground floor. The loft is 12 feet above. The heat reaches the loft by climbing the ladder well, and by the time it reaches the beds, it is barely warmer than the outside air. A tube on a vertical run is harder, Minnie said. The condensate has to fall straight down. But if you angle the tube along the loft wall instead of running it straight up, and pitch it so the fire end is at the bottom and the bed end curves along the loft floor, the return works. Amos and I can draw you a plan. What will it cost me? Labor, yours and mine. Copper if you can find it. Brazing, which means born. I do not charge for the knowledge. Knut looked at her the way men on the frontier looked at a thing they could not categorize. She was not a tradesman selling a service. She was not a charity distributing alms. She was a widow in a barn who knew something that could save his son, and she was giving it away. I have 6 cords of ash, Knut said. Seasoned since last spring. I will deliver 2. I did not ask for payment. I know. I am offering it because you will need fuel to survive long enough to teach the next family. That was the frontier at its best, not generosity, but the blunt recognition that keeping the knowledgeable alive was a community investment. She did not charge for the information. She did not restrict it. She gave it away the way her father had given her the lesson about vapor in a shed in Seneca County, by putting someone's hand near something warm and letting the heat speak for itself. 3 families began sourcing copper by the end of January. 2 more were planning builds for the following autumn when they could work in warmth. One man, a Norwegian named Tollef Haugen, who had lost 2 toes to the blizzard, traded Minnie 3 cords of seasoned oak for a full day of consultation on his claim. 3 cords from Haugen, 2 from Grindheim. The wood she had not been able to cut, buy, or beg arrived because she had something to trade that was not labor and not money. It was knowledge. Her survival math, which had been 6 weeks short in November, was now running a surplus for the first time since Thomas died. Creed heard about the consultations. He heard about the trades. He heard about families who had been considering selling their claims to him at distress prices and were now talking about overwintering instead. 3 families, then 5. Each one a claim he had been waiting to acquire at auction, now anchored by a woman's copper tube and the stubborn refusal to freeze. His response was predictable and immediate. He told anyone who would listen at his store counter that the copper tube was a widow's trick that had gotten lucky in one storm and would kill someone in the next. He said the barn had been warm because of the stove, not the pipe. He said Minnie was selling false hope to people who should be buying real supplies from him on credit at his terms. She has turned a piece of plumbing into a religion, Creed said to a group of men loading grain sacks. And when someone's child gets scalded by a burst seam, it will be on her hands, not mine. I sell tested goods. The men loaded their sacks and said nothing, which was not agreement, but was not disagreement either. Creed still held notes. Creed still controlled credit. Fear of the merchant was not yet smaller than faith in the widow. But Creed made a mistake that week. He said it in front of Ragna Haugen, who had spent the blizzard night holding her children beside a stove that could not reach them. Ragna told Ada. Ada told Born. And Born, who had brazed the seams himself and tested the joints under pressure, took it personally. Creed sells cast iron stove grates that crack in the first winter, Born said to a customer at his shop. I would not trust his opinion on metal any more than I would trust his scales. It was a small thing, a blacksmith's offhand remark. But in a settlement of 40 families, a blacksmith's word about metal carried weight that a merchant's word about commerce did not. Creed's authority cracked, not broken, but cracked, and the crack would widen. but it was closer than it had been a month ago. Amos spent February teaching Minnie everything he knew about closed systems. They worked together in the barn during the short daylight hours, building a second tube, shorter, 10 feet, designed as a bed warmer for a single sleeping platform. This one used a smaller diameter copper line that Amos had sourced from a decommissioned rail depot heating system. He had traded his marking gauge for it and then asked for the gauge back, and the depot foreman had laughed and given him both. The second tube was Amos's classroom. Every step was a lesson. "You are heating the joint too fast," Amos said, watching Minnie practice brazing on scrap copper. "The base metal needs to reach temperature before the rod touches. If you feed the rod into cold copper, you get a bead that looks solid and pulls apart under stress." "How long?" "Until the copper changes color. Watch the color. When it goes from bright to a dull rose, the metal is ready, not before." She learned to braze. Not well, not with Bourne's 30 years of muscle memory, but well enough that Amos tested her joints under pressure and said, "This will hold a winter. I would not certify it for a locomotive, but it will hold a winter." She learned to calculate fill. Amos had a formula he carried in his head from years of thermosiphon work. Fill to 1/3 volume, then back off 2 cups. The margin was for expansion. Steam occupied more space than the water it came from, and a tube filled to exactly 1/3 left no room for the expansion that happened in the first minutes of firing. 2 cups of airspace saved more lives than any safety valve I ever installed, Amos said. Because a safety valve can fail, airspace does not fail. It just sits there and gives the steam room to breathe. She learned to read the sounds. Amos could diagnose a tube by ear the way a physician diagnosed a lung. A low murmur meant healthy flow. A gurgle meant a partial blockage, condensate pooling but not fully trapped. A knock meant a water slug, a section of liquid trapped at a low point and hammered back and forth by vapor pressure. A whistle meant the fire was too high and the pressure was climbing toward the seam's tolerance. "The tube talks to you," Amos said. "Your only job is to listen." They disagreed once, and the disagreement was serious. Minnie wanted to build a longer tube, 40 feet, that could serve the Haugen claim, which had an even larger outbuilding than her barn. Amos said no. He said 40 feet of copper in a single run created too much friction loss, too many bracket points that could shift, and too much distance for the condensate to travel home by gravity alone. 26 feet is near the limit for a single gravity return tube in an uncontrolled environment, Amos said. Your barn works because the run is straight, the pitch is clean, and you check the brackets every morning. Haugen's building is longer and the floor is uneven. A 40-foot run in that space will develop low points you cannot see, and the circulation will fail in the first hard freeze. Then what do we do for Haugen? 2 shorter tubes, 2 separate circuits, each one manageable, each one with its own pitch and its own return path. That takes twice the copper. That takes twice the copper and half the risk. Which trade do you want to make? Minnie wanted to argue. She wanted the elegant solution. 1 tube, 1 circuit, 1 line of heat from fire to bed. Amos wanted the safe solution. They stood on opposite sides of the workbench and looked at each other across the 10-foot practice tube and said nothing for a long time. You're thinking like a builder, Amos said. That is good, but I need you to think like a mechanic. A builder sees the finished thing. A mechanic sees the thing at 3 in the morning when the bracket shifts and nobody is awake to hear the sound change. Minnie yielded, not because Amos was older or louder, because he was right and she knew it, and the knowledge that he was right felt like a cold hand on her chest. The understanding that her instinct toward simplicity could, in someone else's building with someone else's children, become the thing that killed them. 2 tubes, twice the copper, half the risk. She would build it that way. Amos died on the 7th of October, 1888. The chest illness had been with him since the blizzard. Walking a quarter mile through a storm at 56 with a bad leg and insufficient clothing had done something to his lungs that a winter of coughing did not repair and a summer of heat did not cure. He weakened through the spring. He worked through the weakness because working was the only language he had for being alive. In August, he stopped coming to the barn. In September, Minnie brought the 10-foot practice tube to his room at the boarding house, and they tested a new bracket design on his floor while he sat in a chair and directed her hands with his voice. His hands shook too badly to hold the tools, but his ear was still good. He could hear the difference between a clean braze and a cold joint by the way the metal rang when she tapped it. "Sharper," he said when she finished a seam. "Listen, a good joint rings like a bell. A cold joint thunks. That one thunked." She redid it. It rang. "Good," he said. "Now do it again until your hands know the difference without your ears." She brazed 14 practice joints that afternoon. 9 rang, 5 thunked. By the end, her hands were burned in 3 places and her eyes stung from flux smoke, and she could feel the difference between a good joint and a bad one before she tapped it, in the way the rod fed, in the resistance of the copper, in the small bright line where silver met rose-colored metal and became one thing instead of two. On the 6th of October, he gave her his marking gauge, the one he had traded away and gotten back, the one with his initials scratched into the brass. He said, "Heat is honest. It goes where the path allows. Do not let anyone tell you the path is too simple to matter." On the 7th, he died in his chair with the window open because he wanted to feel the air. The boarding house owner found him in the afternoon. His hands were on his knees. His spirit level was in his coat pocket on the door hook. His boots were beside the chair, unlaced, as if he had been about to put them on and go somewhere when the going stopped. Minnie did not attend a funeral because there was no funeral. Amos had no family in the territory. The railroad that had taken his leg and his years sent nothing. She paid for the burial with $3 from the jar behind the loose board. Money she could not afford for a man she could not afford to lose. Born came to the grave. Ada came. Tolifhaugen came, standing on his 8 remaining toes in the October cold, because Amos had checked his bracket design before the installation and saved him from a low-point failure he would not have caught. 4 people at a grave. It was not a large number. But each of them carried something Amos had taught them, and each of them would carry it forward, and that was more than most men got. The barn was quiet that night. The tube murmured. The girls slept. Minnie sat beside the stove with the marking gauge in her lap and the spirit level on the shelf beside her, and understood for the first time what it meant to carry someone's knowledge after they were gone. It was not grief exactly. It was weight. The weight of being the only person in 100 miles who could hear a copper tube and know whether it was healthy, who could diagnose a low point by touch and calculate a fill level from memory and tell the difference between a ring and a thunk. Amos had seen something in her. Not need. Competence. He had walked through a blizzard for it. He had taught for it. He had given her his tools because he trusted that what he knew would not die with him. He was not going to let it die. The secondary crisis came 3 weeks later, on a night in late October when the first hard freeze of the new season caught the township still preparing. The autumn had been mild enough that people had relaxed. Wood was stacked but not measured. Tubes were installed but not checked. The blizzard of January felt distant. A story that had happened to last year's people, not to the people standing in October sunshine caulking window frames. Minnie had not relaxed. She checked her own tube every morning. She walked the line, felt for temperature breaks, listened for the murmur. She had Born inspect the seams once a month. She tested the pitch with Amos's spirit level because the cup of water method was good enough for installation but not for maintenance. Amos had taught her that. The freeze came on October 29th. Not a blizzard, a simple hard freeze. 12 below by midnight with a wind that made it feel like 25. The kind of cold that kills livestock left in open pasture and catches families who thought they had another week. Tolf Haugen's wife, Ragna, sent her oldest boy running to Minnie's barn at 10 o'clock at night. The boy was 11 years old and barefoot because he had not taken time to find his boots. His feet were red, and his voice was high with the particular terror of a child who has been sent on an adult's errand. "The baby is burning," the boy said, "and the pipe is cold." Minnie did not hesitate. She wrapped her girls in blankets, woke Ada's oldest to sit with them, pulled on Thomas's old coat that she had kept because it was warmer than anything she owned, and walked the half-mile to the Haugen claim with a lantern and Amos's tool roll under her arm. The walk was the loneliest half-mile she had ever covered. Every other time she had faced a copper tube in crisis, Amos had been there, in the blizzard, in the practice sessions, in the planning. His voice had been in the room. His hands or his eyes or his ear had been available. Now there was only the dark and the cold and the lantern and the tools she had inherited from a dead man who trusted her to use them right. The Haugen outbuilding was lit by a single lamp. Inside, the stove was roaring. Tolf had overfired it in panic, and the stove corner was dangerously hot while the baby's corner was dangerously cold. The copper tube, one of the two shorter circuits she and Amos had designed, 12 feet, running from a stove cradle to a curtained corner, was silent. No murmur, no sound at all. Ragna was holding the baby against her chest. The baby's face was flushed and dry, the kind of fever heat that frightens the mother more than cold, because cold she understood, and fever she did not. Tolf stood beside the stove, looking like a man who had been given a tool he could not use and a problem he could not solve. "When did it stop?" Minnie asked. "I do not know," Tolf said. "I did not notice until Ragna said the corner was cold. Maybe an hour, maybe two." An hour or two of dead circulation meant the baby's corner had been cooling for an hour or two while Tolf poured heat into the stove that went nowhere useful. An hour or two of wasted fuel. An hour or two of cold creeping toward an infant too sick to shiver. Minnie found the low point in 4 minutes. She had Tolf lift the tube while she shimmed the bracket with a wedge of hardwood and a flat stone. She checked the slope with Amos's spirit level, the brass one with his initials, and tapped the copper at the fire end to encourage the condensate to break free. The gurgle came, then the rush, then the murmur. Ragna put her hand on the copper near the baby's bed and felt it warming. She looked at Minnie with an expression that was not gratitude. It was recognition. The same look Amos had given Minnie a year ago in a barn doorway. The look that says, "You know what you're doing, and I can see it." "You need to check the brackets every week," Minnie said. "Not every month, every week. Walk the line, feel for temperature breaks, and carry a shim." "Tolf will check them," Ragna said. "Tolf needs to learn what a temperature break feels like. Bring him here." She taught Tolf the diagnostic that Amos had taught her. Run your hand along the tube from fire end to cool end. Where the temperature drops sharply instead of gradually, there is a blockage. Where the tube is hot on one side of a bracket and cool on the other, the bracket is shifted. Where the sound changes from murmur to silence, the condensate is trapped. She also taught him what Amos had taught her about fire management. "You are overfiring. Feel the sleeve." Tolf touched the iron near the stove cradle and pulled his hand back. If the sleeve is too hot to touch, the vapor inside is moving too fast and the pressure is climbing. Bank the fire. A copper tube is not a forge. It is a circulation. Moderate heat, steady. Your baby does not need a bonfire. She needs a path. Tolliff listened the way Minnie had listened to Amos, with the intensity of a person who understands that this knowledge is the difference between a warm baby and a cold one. If this story reminds you that the most important knowledge is the kind that gets passed from one person's hands to another, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because what Minnie learned from her father, and what Amos taught her, and what she just taught Tolliff, is the same thing. Heat goes where the path allows. And sometimes building that path is the only thing between your family and the cold. On the walk home, Minnie passed Creed's store. It was dark, closed for the night, but she could see through the window that new stock had arrived, copper tubing, displayed prominently, with a hand-lettered sign she could not read in the dark, but would learn about the next day. Creed was selling copper tubes, pre-cut, pre-bent, sealed at one end with lead solder instead of silver braze. Lead solder. Minnie learned the details the next morning from Ada, who had seen the display and read the sign. Creed was advertising them as patent heat conductors, ready-made for any stove. He was selling them for $4 each, pre-sealed, with a one-page instruction sheet that said nothing about fill levels, nothing about pitch discipline, nothing about expansion space, and nothing about the difference between lead and silver. Lead melted at a lower temperature than silver. It was cheaper. It was easier to work. And it was weaker under sustained heat stress by a margin that would not show in a demonstration, but would show in a winter. A lead soldered joint on a tube that ran near a stove would soften through repeated heat cycles, flex at the transition points, and eventually weep, not in a dramatic burst, but in a slow leak that would go unnoticed until the fill level dropped. When the fill dropped far enough, the fire end would dry out. Dry copper against stove heat would overheat, and an overheated tube with reduced water and a weakened seam would fail the way Bourne had always feared, violently in the night, in a room where children slept. Creed did not know this. That was the worst part. He was not deliberately building weapons. He was building products, which on the frontier amounted to the same thing when the product was a sealed pressure vessel, and the builder did not understand what was inside it. Minnie could warn people. She could tell them what to look for. She could explain the difference between a braze and a solder, between a calculated fill and a guess, between a system designed by someone who understood return fall and a tube sold by a man who understood markup. But Creed's tubes cost $4. Minnie's knowledge required copper, Bourne's labor, and time. In a settlement where cash was scarce and winter was coming, $4 and a one-page sheet looked like a solution. It looked like exactly the kind of solution that kills people 3 months after they buy it. Minnie walked home in the dark with Amos's tool roll under her arm and the understanding that survival was not the hardest part. The hardest part was what came after, when other people saw what worked and decided to sell a cheaper version of it without understanding what made it work. She had built a heater. She had taught the knowledge. Now she had to protect the knowledge from someone who would hollow it out for profit. The barn was warm when she arrived. The tube murmured. The girls were asleep. She put Amos's marking gauge on the shelf beside his spirit level and sat in the dark and planned what she would do about Silas Creed. Minnie did not fight Creed with argument. She fought him with demonstration. The week after she discovered the lead soldered tubes in his window, she invited every family that had purchased one, there were 3, to her barn on a Saturday afternoon. She lit the stove, warmed her own tube, and let them hear the murmur. Then she took one of Creed's tubes, the one the Phelps family had bought and not yet installed, and laid it on the workbench. She heated the sealed end with a candle flame, not a forge, not a stove, a candle. In less than 2 minutes, the lead solder softened and beaded. She pushed the tip of a nail into the joint. It went through. That is lead, Minnie said. Lead melts at a temperature your stove will reach every night. Silver braze does not. Bourne's joints on my tube have survived 4 months of daily firing, a blizzard that killed 2 people, and a bracket failure that would have burst a weak seam. This joint would not survive a week. She held up Creed's instruction sheet. This says nothing about fill level. If you fill this tube to the top, you have no expansion space. The pressure will build until the lead gives, and the lead will give because that is what lead does under heat. This says nothing about pitch. If you mount this flat, the condensate will not return, and the fire end will dry out and overheat. This says nothing about what the tube sounds like when it is working or when it is dying. She set the sheet down. I'm not telling you what to buy. I am telling you what I know. A copper tube that moves heat safely has 3 requirements: silver brazed seams, a calculated fill, and a maintained pitch. Without all 3, it is not a heater. It is the thing Bourne warned me about the first day I showed him my design. The 3 families returned Creed's tubes. 2 of them asked Minnie to build proper systems on their claims. The third, the Phelps family, Creed's own clerk, said nothing and installed nothing, and spent the winter burning wood the old way because loyalty to an employer is a kind of warmth too, and it dies harder than cold. Creed did not come to the barn. He did not confront Minnie. He adjusted his inventory, marked the remaining tubes down to $2, and waited. He was not finished. Men like Creed were never finished because their survival did not depend on being right. It depended on being necessary, and Creed had been necessary in Hadley Township for a long time. But the ground was shifting under him, and he could feel it. By the second winter, 1888 into 89, Minnie had built or supervised the construction of 7 copper tube systems across 4 claims. Each one was different. Each one was designed for the specific building, the specific stove, the specific sleeping arrangement, and the specific family. The Greenheim loft system used an angled run along the loft wall, rising from the ground floor stove to a bed-end bracket 12 feet above. The condensate returned through a separate narrow tube that dropped vertically beside the chimney and fed back into the fire end. It was the most complex system she had built, and it worked because she had argued with Amos about it in her head for 3 days before she drew the first line, imagining his objections, his questions about low points and friction loss, until she had answered everyone. The Haugen dual circuit system served 2 sleeping areas from a single stove, each tube running its own path with its own pitch and its own return. Tolliff maintained both circuits himself now, checking brackets weekly, carrying a shim in his coat the way Amos had carried his spirit level. The Mercer system was the simplest, a 10-foot bed warmer that Ada had initially dismissed as pointless, and now called the only reason her youngest slept through the night. Orrin Mercer, who had stood in Minnie's barn with his arms crossed and said nothing a year earlier, now checked the brackets himself every Sunday morning before church. He carried a shim in his vest pocket. He did not talk about the tube to other men. He did not need to. The fact that his children slept warm spoke louder than any testimony he could give. Each installation taught Minnie something new. The Greenheim loft taught her about vertical runs and condensate management in tight spaces. The Haugen dual circuit taught her about balancing 2 systems off one heat source without starving either. A system she built for a family named Espeland, who had a sod house with thick walls but a single tiny window that created a dead air pocket in the corner where their grandmother slept, taught her that sometimes the problem was not distance but obstruction. The heat path needed to curve around a barrier, and a curved tube required more brackets and a more careful pitch calculation than a straight one. She kept notes, not in a ledger, she could not afford paper in quantity, but in charcoal on barn boards that she stored in the loft. Diagrams, measurements, failure points, and their causes. The boards accumulated through the winter like pages of a book written in soot, and when spring came and the barn warmed enough that the tube fell silent, she transferred the most important notes to a sheet of butcher paper that Bourne gave her from his shop. Bourne was present for every installation. He brazed every joint. He tested every seam under pressure before the tube was mounted. And somewhere in the second winter, the relationship between the blacksmith and the widow shifted from professional respect to something quieter and harder to name. It happened through labor, not language. Bourne forged a new bracket design, a U-shaped iron cradle with a threaded adjustment bolt that let the user raise or lower the tube's pitch without removing the bracket from the wall. He brought it to the barn on a Tuesday and set it on the workbench without explanation. Minnie picked it up, turned it in her hands, and understood immediately what it was for. "This eliminates the shim," she said. "The shim works, but a shim can slip. A bolt does not slip." She looked at him. He looked at the bracket. Neither of them looked at each other in the way that people look at each other when something is changing, because neither of them was the kind of person who acknowledged change through eye contact. They acknowledged it through work. "Make me 12, Minnie said. "I already made 12, Bourne said. He installed them himself on her barn tube the following week, replacing every iron strap she had bent over a stump a year earlier. He worked in silence for 4 hours, and when he was done, the tube hung on forged iron with the precision of a railroad line, and every bracket could be adjusted by hand with a wrench. He came back the next day to check his work. He came back the day after that to adjust a bolt that he said was a quarter turn too tight. He came back the day after that with no stated reason, and Minnie gave him coffee, and they sat in the stove corner and talked about copper gauge and pitch ratios, and whether iron pipe could ever substitute for copper in a gravity return system, and the conversation lasted 2 hours and felt like 5 minutes. That was courtship on the frontier. Not flowers, not declarations. A man making 12 brackets he had not been asked to make, and a woman asking for 12 more. The winter of 1889 caught Silas Creed the way winter catches every man who has counted on his position instead of his preparation. A supply shipment from Sioux Falls failed to arrive in November. The freight road closed early under heavy snow, and the backup route through the river bottoms flooded and froze into an impassable sheet of ice and mud. Creed's store shelves thinned through December. His heating stock, stove parts, chimney fittings, fireplace grates sold out before Christmas, and the storeroom behind his shop, where he slept on a cot surrounded by inventory that was supposed to keep him warm by proximity to commerce, turned out to be exactly what it was: a poorly insulated room with a stove too small for the space and no way to move heat from the iron to the cot 12 feet away. The irony was not subtle enough to require commentary. Creed held out for 3 weeks. He burned inventory, crate wood, paper stock, barrel staves, the pine shelving from the back wall. He wore his coat and his hat to bed. He stuffed rags in the window frames and nailed a horse blanket over the back door and piled grain sacks against the north wall for insulation. The stove corner stayed livable. The cot corner did not. 12 feet of cold air sat between Creed and the iron, and the air did not care that he owned the building, the stove, and the inventory. Heat rose. Heat vanished into the ceiling. The cot stayed cold. 12 feet. Minnie's original problem had been 32. But the principle was the same, and Creed had spent 2 years refusing to understand it. On the 4th week, the temperature dropped to 19 below and held there for 3 days. Creed developed a cough that sounded like gravel in a bucket. His fingers turned white at the tips. He stopped opening the store. Phelps, his clerk, came by twice and left food outside the door because Creed would not open it. Ada told Minnie. Ada told her the way frontier women tell each other things that are both cruel and factual, standing in Minnie's barn with a pot of soup in one hand and the other hand on her hip. Creed is freezing in his own store, Ada said. He has been burning inventory for a month. His cot is 12 feet from his stove, and he might as well be sleeping outside for all the good it does him. He will not ask anyone for help because he is Silas Creed, and Silas Creed does not need anything from anyone, especially not from you. Minnie said nothing for a long time. She listened to the murmur of her own tube, the one that had kept her children alive, the one Creed had called a widow's trick and a still heater and a religion. He sold lead-soldered tubes to 3 families, Minnie said. I know. He called what I built a widow's trick. I know. He told the township I was going to burn down the barn and kill my children. I know that too. Ada set the soup pot on the workbench. I am not telling you to help him. I am telling you the facts. What you do with them is your business. Minnie put on her coat. She picked up Amos's tool roll, a length of copper tube she had been saving for a repair job, and a tin of silver brazing rod from Bourne's shop. She walked to Creed's store in the dark. She did not knock. The door was unlocked because Creed no longer had the energy to lock it. She found him on the cot, wrapped in a horse blanket, with his stove-burning barrel staves and his breath-making clouds 4 feet from the fire. The storeroom smelled of smoke and cold sweat, and the particular staleness of a man who has been lying in the same clothes for days. Shelves that should have held canned goods and hardware were bare. The floor was littered with wood shavings from crates he had broken apart for fuel. Get up, Minnie said. Creed did not get up. He looked at her from the cot with the expression of a man who has lost every argument he did not know he was having. I did not ask for help, Creed said. I know. Get up anyway. Why are you here? Because you are freezing to death in a room with a stove, and I know how to fix that, and letting you freeze does not fix anything else. Creed sat up. The horse blanket fell from his shoulders, and she saw that he was wearing 2 shirts, a vest, and his store apron, and his hands were shaking. She found one of his own lead-soldered tubes in the inventory stack. She held it up. This is what you sold, she said. This is what almost went into homes with children. She pressed her thumbnail into the sealed end. The lead yielded slightly under the pressure, not a failure, but the softness was visible. Feel that. That is what $4 bought. She set it on the counter. I'm going to build you a system that works, and when I'm done, you're going to understand why what you sold was dangerous, and you're never going to sell another one. Creed did not argue. He was too cold to argue. He got up and stood by the stove and watched Minnie work. She measured the room. 14 feet from stove to cot. She paced it twice, checking the floor with Amos's spirit level. The floor was level, which was a problem. She needed pitch. And a level floor meant shimming the fire end down or raising the cot end up. She stacked 3 bricks under the cot legs, raising the sleeping end by 4 inches. Not enough for a longer run, but enough for 14 feet. She cut the copper tube to length with a hacksaw she found in Creed's tool bin, filing the cut end smooth the way Amos had taught her. No burrs, no rough edges, nothing that could catch debris or disrupt flow. She fitted the iron sleeve near the stove, shaped a small expansion bulb at the cot end with a mallet, and cleaned every joint surface bright with a wire brush before brazing. The brazing took 90 minutes. Creed watched every joint. He did not speak. The flux smoked. The silver rod melted and wicketed into the seams with the capillary pull that Bourne had taught her to watch for, the sign that the base metal was at temperature and the bond was forming correctly. She checked each joint twice, tapping with a small hammer, listening for the ring. Every joint rang. She filled the tube to 1/3 volume, 5 cups of water through the fill port, counted aloud the way Amos had counted for her on the first morning in the barn. She sealed the fill port with a copper plug and silver solder, mounted the brackets, 4 of Bourne's adjustable design, and checked the pitch with the spirit level. Light the stove, she said, gently, not like you have been burning it, half the draft, a quarter load. Creed lit the stove with barrel stave kindling and closed the draft to half. The iron warmed, the sleeve conducted. Within 10 minutes, the tube murmured. Within 15, the cot-end copper was warm. Creed put his hand on the tube near his cot. He held it there for a long time. His hand was still shaking, but now from something other than cold. He did not look at Minnie. "This is what it does," he said. Not a question. "This is what it does when it is built correctly. Silver braze, 1/3 fill, steady pitch, moderate fire. The tube does the rest." "And mine? The ones I sold?" "Your lead solder would have failed by February. The fill instructions were wrong. The pitch instructions were missing. Someone's child would have been sleeping next to a seam that was softening every night, and they would not have known until it opened." Creed sat on his cot. The copper warmed beside him. Outside, the temperature was 19 below, and the wind was pushing snow against the storefront windows. The murmur filled the room, that low, continuous note that Minnie heard the way other people heard birdsong. Ordinary. Alive. Right. "I did not know," Creed said. "I know," Minnie said. "That is the problem. You did not know, and you sold it anyway because selling is what you do. But this is not hardware. This is not nails and stove grates and canned peaches. This is a sealed vessel with water under heat near sleeping children. The margin between working and killing is a fill level and a seam material, and you did not bother to learn which was which." Creed said nothing. There was nothing to say. The tube murmured beside him, and the room was warming, and the woman who had built it was already putting Amos's tools back in the roll. She left him with the tube and the warmth and the understanding that the woman he had called desperate, foolish, and dangerous had just saved his life with the method he had mocked and then cheapened and then failed to replicate. Creed survived the winter. He reopened the store in March. He never sold another copper tube. And when people asked him about Minnie Hale's heating systems, he said nothing, which on the frontier was the loudest kind of endorsement a proud man could give. Bourne asked Minnie to marry him in the spring of 1889. He did not ask with words. He asked by building a partition wall inside the barn, framed, insulated with straw and clay, and fitted with a proper door that divided the sleeping end from the work end and created, for the first time, something that looked less like a livestock shelter and more like a home. Minnie found the wall going up on a morning when she had taken the girls to Ada's for washing. She came back to the sound of Bourne's hammer and the smell of fresh-cut pine, and stood in the doorway and understood what she was looking at. The wall was framed with the care he gave to every piece of iron that left his forge, plumb, square, and built to last longer than the building around it. He had cut a pass-through for the copper tube so it would not need to be remounted. "You did not ask," she said. "I'm asking now," Bourne said. He did not stop hammering. "The answer can wait until I finish the header." "It cannot," Minnie said. Bourne stopped hammering. He turned around with a nail between his teeth and sawdust on his shoulders, and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been precise about everything in his life except this. "Is that a yes or a hurry?" he asked. "Both." The wedding was held in June at the township meeting hall, and the reception was in the barn, which was the only structure in Hadley Township where every corner was warm. Ada Mercer stood beside Minnie and held her hand during the vows, which was not the custom, but was the truth of who had stood beside her from the beginning. Tolf Haugen brought his family. Knut Greinheim brought his son, the boy who had nearly died in the blizzard, now a year older and a year louder and alive because his father had learned to think about heat paths instead of stove size. Even Creed came. He stood at the back. He did not congratulate anyone. He bought a drink at the table and left early. But he came. The years after compressed the way years do when the crisis is past and the living begins. The barn gained a second room, then a third. Bourne framed them with the same precision he brought to bracket forging square corners, plumb walls, and headers that could bear load. The original copper tube stayed mounted on the south wall through every renovation, its seams darkened with years of gentle heat, its brackets replaced twice with Bourne's improved adjustable design, its murmur unchanged. It had become part of the structure the way a beam becomes part of a house, not decorative, not sentimental, just necessary. The girls grew. The older one, who had stacked kindling at 7 while her mother filed copper by lamplight, learned to braise before she learned to braid her own hair. Bourne taught her at the forge the way he had taught no one before, patiently, with exact standards, and with the understanding that a girl who could read a seam by ear was a girl who could survive anything a plains winter threw at her. She made her first clean joint at age 10. It rang. Bourne nodded once, which from Bourne was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The younger one, who had burned with fever while the blizzard screamed, grew into a girl and then a woman who checked the water bucket beside her bed every winter morning out of a habit she could not remember learning. She never built a tube. She never learned to braise. But she understood what the murmur meant, and she never slept in a room without listening for it. Bourne and Minnie built systems together for 11 years. He forged. She designed. They argued, but Minnie took it as a personal failure, and after that she would not build a system for any claim she could not visit at least twice in the first winter. By the early 1890s, Minnie was known in the district not for a single miracle night, but for a body of winter knowledge that had spread through teaching, not selling. Where to place beds relative to heat sources, how to curtain air volume so warmth pooled where bodies slept instead of climbing into empty loft space, how to move heat instead of merely making more of it, how to tell the difference between a working steam tube and a death trap by the sound it made at 3 in the morning. She never built a system she had not inspected. She never let a tube leave her barn without silver brazed seams. She never stopped checking brackets, because Amos had taught her that level was the first thing to fail and the last thing people checked, and she was not going to let his lesson die with her either. Families stopped thinking only in terms of stove size and started thinking in terms of heat path, sleeping zone protection, and managed airspace. Mothers tested their children's sleeping corners with a tin cup of water before bed. If the water skinned with ice by morning, the room was still losing. If it stayed liquid, the path was holding. That was the transformation the story was really about. Not copper, not steam, not a single desperate invention built in a barn by a woman with $12 and a memory of her father's still. The transformation was in the thinking, the shift from build a bigger fire to teach the fire where to go. Minnie taught it the way Amos had taught her and the way her father had taught her before that, by putting someone's hand near something warm and making them understand why it was warm. She held classes in her barn on winter Saturdays. Not formal, not announced, just word passed through Ada and Ragna and the other women who had learned to think about heat paths. Farmers came with diagrams scratched on slate. Young wives came with questions about sickroom warming. An old man who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite came and sat in the corner and listened and said at the end, "I wish someone had told me this 30 years ago." And Minnie said, "Someone tried. The trouble is that heat is invisible, and people do not believe in things they cannot see until the cold makes them." She taught the cup of water test for pitch, simple, available to anyone, requiring no tools that a homesteader did not already own. She taught the fill rule, 1/3 volume minus 2 cups for expansion. She taught the sound diagnostic, murmur, gurgle, knock, whistle, silence, and made every student close their eyes and listen to her own tube until they could name what they heard without being told. She taught the safety rule that Bourne had insisted on from the beginning: silver braze or nothing, no lead, no tin, no solder that softened under the temperature a stove produced on a normal winter night. The saying that attached itself to Minnie's name was not grand. It was the kind of thing a woman says while checking a bracket on a cold morning. The kind of thing that sounds like common sense until you realize that common sense is just knowledge that someone bled to earn and then gave away for free. Warm the bed, not the rafters. Within 3 winters of the blizzard, 11 households in the Hadley Township district had adopted some version of Minnie's principle. Not identical systems, she would not allow identical systems because every building was different and every family's sleeping arrangement was its own problem. But targeted heat transfer, paired with curtained sleeping zones and managed air volume, became a practice instead of an experiment. Mothers tested sleeping corners with tin cups of water. Bourne's adjustable brackets became the standard mount, and one detail spread farther than any tube: the sound. People learned to listen for the murmur the way they listened for a healthy heartbeat, the low, continuous note that meant heat was traveling, condensate was falling, and the path was open. Minnie lived the rest of her life on the plains. She was never rich. She was never idle. The barn that had been a death sentence in the autumn of 1887 became, over the years, a workshop, a classroom, a home, and finally, after Bourne added a porch, and the girls planted a windbreak of cottonwoods along the north side, something that looked from the road, almost like a place someone had chosen instead of a place someone had been trapped. She outlived Bourne by 4 years. She spent those years the way she had spent the ones before, checking brackets, teaching fill levels, listening for the murmur in other people's homes the way a mother listens for breathing in a child's room. Her last winter was mild. She died in the spring, with the window open, because she wanted to feel the air, the same way Amos had gone, though she did not plan it that way. Some choices are not inherited. They are convergent. On the shelf beside her bed sat a brass marking gauge with scratched initials and a spirit level that had once walked through a blizzard in a coat pocket. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature on the northern plains dropped more than 60 degrees in less than half a day. Elias Bourne, who had worked iron for 30 years and buried his wife to fever, had stood in a widow's barn and looked at a copper tube and said, "If that seam opens in the night, your girls die first because they are sleeping at the far end." He was not wrong about the danger. He was wrong about the woman. By dawn, the rafters were still white with frost. The stove corner was ash gray and cooling. The north wall wore white collars on every nail. But under the bed curtain at the far end, where no stove should have reached, where Minerva Hale had aimed a sealed copper tube and trusted vapor to carry what hot air could not, the girls slept barefaced, and the bucket beside them had not frozen,